pretty informal, so if you have some questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask those, or if you prefer to wait to the end, that's fine as well. And then also, I'll be watching that chat box as well if you want to type one in there. But as Cody said, we're going to talk about feeding considerations. I know y'all talked about some other considerations when it came to weaning last week. But just a quick refresher on some things just to make sure we're all on the same page. When we're talking about weaning, sometimes there's some confusion when we talk about terminology or exactly what we mean by that. And I kind of break it up into three groups. So traditional weaning, where we think about weaning those calves at 6 to 8 months of age under normal conditions. Weaning the calves maybe a month or two early to save or improve body condition on the cow. So that may be if we're in a mild drought, we may look at weaning a month or two early, or maybe we just had some cows for whatever reason aren't quite in the condition they need to be, so we need to give them a little more time to get back into condition before that next calf we could wean in that situation. You'll hear a lot of people talk about early weaning. When I refer to early weaning, what I'm talking about is actually weaning those calves at 45 to 60 days of age. And yes, we can wean them that early. There's some changes in the feeding program we need to make. But if we're in a situation where we're in a bad drought and we need to wean those calves at that age to get those cows to cycle and come back into heat and maintain that yearly breeding interval, we definitely have that option available to us. But realize the feeding I'm going to talk about today is really going to focus on these first two situations. So those calves that are weaned normally, or maybe they're just weaned a month or two earlier than what we would typically think about doing. What would be some of our goals during the weaning program? We want to keep those calves growing at a moderate rate. We don't need them growing real fast, and I'll talk through some of the economics about that here later. The other thing is, if we try to get too much weight gain on those calves during the weaning phase, those calves stay pretty fleshy, and typically that's something those buyers are not going to like. They're going to want them in adequate condition, but they don't want them carrying extra flesh. So I think it's a good target in most situations to be thinking about growing those calves at about 3/4 of a pound to 1.5 pounds a day is plenty in my mind. We want to look at keeping our costs down because we can easily spend more on feeding than what is justified in that scenario. We want to keep in mind rumen health and make sure we feed those calves in a manner that we don't create any subacute acidosis or acidosis that will reduce performance on those calves and actually cause them not to perform as well later on in the feedlot also. And then we need that moderate rate of gain so we can optimize that immune function, let those calves continue to build their immune system from those vaccines that we gave them, which is what we're trying to do to increase value in them so they bring more when we go to sell them. Just a few tips, and you probably covered some of these last week. I'm going to recover a couple of them just because of the impact they have on animal performance in our feeding program. But we really need to pay attention to the environment from a dust standpoint that's going to reduce performance in those cows or in those calves, and potentially create some respiratory issues. Shade is real important. So if we think about a fall calving operation that may be weaning calves in May or June, definitely getting into the hot time of year, and we need to make sure we have good shade available for those calves, because if we don't, it will reduce how much they eat and how they perform. And even if we think about a spring born calf that we're weaning in September, potentially, we can get plenty hot in September as well. So still, shade's going to be important. I want to try to avoid putting those calves in muddy conditions. That's going to hurt performance. And then animal crowding, we definitely want to avoid that as well. And then perform those health management practices prior to weaning. I know Cody talked about this last week. Really, we want to just try to, on the day we wean, just trip the cows from the calves and not do anything else. And depending on how you set things up, you can actually, if you don't get all your vaccine done pre-weaning, you can come back 7 to 10 days post-weaning and vaccinate those calves. That works really well. It's something we use in our family operation, especially in regards to using modified live viral vaccines and making sure we maintain a safety window there. we know we need to keep those animals calm and quiet just to make the weaning process go well, but it's actually going to have a big impact on our animal performance as well. If we get those calves stirred up when we're separating them from the cows, they're going to spend more time walking the fences and burning calories and less time eating. And so we're going to see some differences in performance. So if you look at the calves in this picture, I'll tell you it was taken about 30 minutes after they were separated. This was a drought year several years ago, so you can see the pastures aren't in real good condition. So we are going to have to feed a little more in a scenario like that. But if you look, we got a couple of calves laying right next to the fence in the shade, and that's where we really want to think about shade too, is along that fence line, because that's where those calves are going to spend a fair bit of time. But then we have these calves 30 minutes after they were separated that are actually out there. It was done in a calm and quiet manner. They're actually out there grazing what little green pickings were available. So the way we handle those calves is going to have an influence on how they perform. So talked about shade already, but just going to continue to emphasize how important that is, because if those calves get hot, they're not going to eat as much. We know intakes go down during the summer, so that's something we want to think about and be mindful for. We also want to be mindful of how close our water source is to where those calves are going to be weaned. We don't want them to have to walk a long distance to get access to that drinking water, whether that be a water trough, whether that be a pond, whether that be a stream or river. Ideally, I'd like to have it within a couple hundred yards of that if we're fence line weaning, where they're going to be fence line weaned. If they're in a corral, that's going to be a different story. But make sure we do have access to good, clean drinking water, and that that water's not too hot, especially if we're weaning those calves during May, June, July, or September. Another thing that really can help your weaning program go a little smoother is actually to train those calves to eat out of a feed bunk prior to weaning. So there's a couple different ways we can go about that. The easiest way, or one of the easiest ways, is if we'll just take the pairs and feed them for typically 3 to 5 times, depending on the cow herd, prior to weaning, is enough to train those calves to eat to that bunk. Some people actually use a creep gate, and maybe they have that creep gate set up where those calves can go into a different pasture where they have some bunks that they put out there to eat. But I want them to understand when we go to feed and hand feed those calves what that bunk is and what's going on there. I will tell you, if you're in a situation where you had to feed the cow herd a decent amount when those calves were just a few months old, they do tend to retain that memory pretty well, and that'll work to train them to the bunk as well. But at least try to feed those pairs 3 to 5 times before we get ready to wean those calves. Just make the process a whole lot easier. So then now to get into some more of the details on the nutrition side of things. Hopefully we're using a good free choice mineral in the cow-calf operation. We want to make sure during the weaning period we continue to provide a appropriate mineral for those calves. And there's a lot of different feeders we can use. The big thing I would tell you is you want to use something similar to what you were using when those calves were beside the cow. So don't just totally change your mineral feeder in that situation. The other thing I'll comment on is a true open mineral feeder just doesn't work real well in our environment. We just get a little too much rain. So we do want some cover, whether that's a typical wind vane mineral feeder, pretty easy for those calves to get in there and it's easy to refill. May not want to have that same type if we're dealing with the cow herd, because bulls do tend to beat those up pretty good, but they do work well for weaned calves or replacement heifers, whether it's a homemade built unit where we just have some tin and then have some kind of wooden platform or plastic barrel or something in the bottom of it, or even a bull type mineral feeder. If they're used to that with that rubber flap, those calves will use that and do just fine in that situation. So when we think about mineral supplementation in a little more detail, in Texas, there's going to be three common formulations that you'll typically see marketed. What I would call a higher calcium, lower phosphorus, and just some examples of some of the major companies out there. Their levels are going to be, this one is 15% calcium, 4% phosphorus, 16% calcium, 5% phosphorus, 15 and 7.5. So you see at minimum, we have a 2-to-1 ratio. We're looking for somewhere between a 2-to-1 to a 3 or 3.5-to-1 ratio on calcium and phosphorus. Generally speaking, as we drop the phosphorus level in that mineral, the cattle will eat it better. Plus, that mineral is typically going to go down in price because phosphorus is going to be one of the most expensive components in that mineral. There's also similar calcium phosphorus levels or of minerals out there are also maybe a little higher phosphorus. So you can see those examples there. And then if we're on winter pasture, for the cow herd, we do want to pay attention to magnesium, not real critical for those calves. If we were weaning some calves in winter pasture, on those weaned calves, we'd really want to pay attention to calcium. And I want to make sure that calcium is setting up there, hopefully 18 or maybe even 20%. A lot of situations that mineral we're using for the cow herd, especially if it's only got 5% magnesium in there, can work very well to wean calves. But if we think about the majority of our scenarios, the mineral we're actually going to be using during the weaning period is going to be that higher calcium, lower phosphorus mineral there. Just to kind of give you some more specific examples, and these are not all of the good options out there, but these are three well-known companies that do have products spread across the state pretty well. So if we're looking at grazing those calves on introduced pasture, even if we were grazing on actively grown native range, we would use the same mineral here, or if we're on hay. So these options are really going to cover the majority of situations when we're talking about weaned calves. If you're looking at feeding the Cargill mineral, we would look at feeding the Emerald for those calves. That's going to be the same one we're going to be using in the cow herd. If we're looking at Purina, we would look at the All Season 5 or the All Season 7.5 complete. And that 5 and 7.5 just refers to the level of phosphorus in that mineral. And if we were looking at A&M, we would be looking at the Amped A product. All three of those, or all four of those, I should say, are examples of higher calcium, lower phosphorus minerals that would work very well for our weaned calves. Big part of the nutrition program when we think about a weaned calf is our grazing management and our forage program. And so we want to plan that grazing program so that we have high quality pasture that is available in the weaning pasture at that weaning location or that weaning facility. We want to make sure the pasture is not too large. It's typically not a problem in North Texas, but if we were to get out west, we can get into some really big pastures and that doesn't work as well in that situation. And then if we were looking at weaning some calves kind of later in the fall, we could actually use some stockpiled Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or native range if we did a good job of stockpiling that. So we really want to focus on the forage program because that's going to be the most cost-effective option when we think about getting those calves through the weaning period before we market them. So a couple things to think about from a forage quality standpoint is definitely we're going to see some differences in species. And I'll talk about that more here on the next few slides. Maturity, the more mature that forage is going to be, the lower quality. Now that doesn't mean we need that pasture short out there. It's okay if it's 18 to 24 inches tall if we're talking about Bermuda grass. We want it to typically try to have it growing for 3 to 4, maybe 5 weeks before we wean those calves. And what they'll do is if we give them plenty of forage out there, they can select and they'll eat the younger, tender leaves and stems on that plant. Where the maturity really comes into play is if we were trying to grow that forage all summer and then we went into a dry period and we were trying to graze that very mature, introduced forage, that's not going to work real well. So we do want to think about that grazing program. On stockpiled forage, if we're talking about Bermuda grass or Bahia grass for that north central Texas region, what we would want to look at is coming in there last week of August, first week of September, either graze those fields down or cut some hay off of them, come back in there with at least 50 to 60 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. And then we'll actually let that grow for 60 to 75 days before frost. The frost isn't going to hurt the quality of that forage any, it's just going to keep it from growing at that point in time. So if we do a good job of stockpiling, that works well. On that stockpile forage, we really want to look at getting it utilized by about the 1st of January, because in our higher rainfall environments, it just won't stay longer than that. If we were in a really low rainfall environment out west, then that forage will hold up much longer. But in our environment, really want to think about using it by about first part of January. So I told you we would look at some species differences. So just to kind of give you some ideas. So this is assuming we're at a moderate stocking rate. We're not heavily grazing that pasture. We're allowing some selection in those scenarios. If we look at stocker calves or even our replacement heifers, or I should say those weaned calves, stocker calves would fit this, or replacement heifers would fit this as well. The smaller animals, so the lighter weight calves, so a 400-pound calf is not going to do quite as well as a 600-pound calf on our Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, but they'll do all right. So if we look at Tifton 85 or Old World blue stems, and when we're talking Old World blue stems, that's totally different than big blue stem and little blue stem. These are going to be things like King Ranch blue stem, Clayburg blue stem, or the most common one now is going to be WWB doll. Remember, Tifton 85 is not a true Bermuda grass. It's actually a Bermuda grass stargrass cross. So we see a little better performance there. But for these introduced species, we would think about average daily gain being in the neighborhood of 1 to 1.6 pounds, depending on our grazing conditions and our stocking rates and the size of those calves as well. If we talk about hybrid Bermuda grasses and then Bahia grass, we're going to see a little less performance, so typically 3/4 pound to 1.25 pounds a day in that situation. If we were growing some warm season annuals, or we had some that just happened to volunteer in regards to something like crabgrass, we do see better performance on our annual species than our perennial species. So if we were grazing some sorghum Sudan grass hybrids or Sudan grass, then 2 pounds to 2.75 pounds a day. And I know this was more than the target I was talking about earlier. If we're getting more than that target in a grazing scenario, that's absolutely fine. It's just typically we don't want to feed them to get them up above that, because it's not cost effective, but can be very cost effective in a grazing situation. If we look at something like crabgrass or pearl millet, we would see somewhere between 1.25 pounds and about 2 pounds a day is what we would typically expect on that situation. Then if we had some calves that we were weaning over the winter and we were grazing some cool season annual forages, we're looking a little higher performance there, somewhere between about 1.5 pounds and 2.85 pounds a day for things like ryegrass or small grains. If we're looking at rye, wheat, oats, barley, something like that. I'm going to tell you, for most people, we're probably going to be looking at one of those introduced warm season perennial forages. So one of these, that Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Tifton 85, or Old World blue stem, is commonly what we're going to be grazing on. So I mentioned we really have to look at cost of that gain, what that additional gain is worth, and figure that into our nutrition and feeding program for those weaned calves. So let's just take this example here, and let's say a 500-pound steer was bringing $1.45. So it tells us 500 pounds times $1.45, he's worth $720. Now, what we could look at is say, all right, well, let's say we wanted to feed him and have that calf gain 2 pounds a day, which is what a lot of people want to do before they actually sat down and worked through the math. So in that situation, 620-pound steer is worth $1.32, so $818.40 is what he's worth. And what the real question is that we need to think about when it comes to our feeding program is, what is each additional pound of weight gain worth? So going from 500 to 620, what is that additional weight worth? Is it worth $1.45 a pound? Is it worth $1.32 a pound? Or is it worth something less than that? Okay, the answer is going to be, it's actually going to be worth less than that. But the way we would figure out what that additional weight gain is worth, or what's the value of that additional weight gain from feeding more, is we take our difference in weight. So 620 minus 500 pounds, we change the weight of that calf by 120 pounds. How much did we change the value by? So 818 minus 725, we change the value by $93.40. So now we can take that change in value divided by the change in weight, and that tells us for each additional pound of gain we put on that calf, it's only worth about 78 cents in this situation. I will tell you, typically when we look at value of gain, it's going to be worth 75 to 85 cents is typically where it's at. And so what we have to think about is our feeding program. How many pounds of feed does it take to get an additional pound of gain? And does it cost me more or less than that 78 cents? A lot of times it's going to end up costing us more than that. And so that's why we don't typically want to try to feed those calves a lot and really try to push additional weight gain on them, because we could actually be losing money in that situation. Now, I will tell you what some of the challenges we saw in the market earlier in the year, back in May or June. Our value of gain was considerably less than this. It's kind of come back into line of what we would traditionally expect here lately. And if you're kind of wondering about those price differences, what you can do is go back and look at, how did I market those calves last year, and get a price report from last year at that same time of year on what that price difference was between those different weights of animals. Some general rules of thumb on that is, when price of corn is really, really cheap, value of gain is going to be less. And the reason being is the feedlots are going to tell you that if corn's cheap, they would rather buy lighter weight animals and put more weight on them because they can do it very cost effectively. And so in that situation, they're not going to pay as much for that additional weight gain. On the other hand, if the price of corn gets very expensive, like it did back in 2008, the value of gain goes up, meaning instead of 80 cents, it may actually be $1. And what the market's telling you in that situation is, the more weight you can put on those calves on grass, the better off you're going to be. Now, what you want to realize is, think about who can put weight on cheaper, or who can buy feed cheaper, if we're talking about actually feeding them, not grazing them, but feeding them. So you're buying maybe a couple tons of feed. A feedlot's buying thousands of tons of feed in a week. And so they're going to be able to buy feed much cheaper than we can. So as cow-calf producers, we need to really utilize our forage program to get those cost-effective gains on those calves. If you're interested in playing with that value of gain a little bit more, I actually put a spreadsheet together on this, and it's on our beef.tamu.edu website. So if you'll just go to beef.tamu.edu, click on publications, and then scroll down to spreadsheets, you'll see a value of gain spreadsheet. And if we have some time, I can actually pull it up and show you a little more detail. But it's set up so you can put the weight of the animal in there, the price of the animal in there. And if we're just looking at that additional weight for that calf, if we fed more or less during the weaning period, just put the start date and the projected sell date the same. They're not real critical in that point, but put our price and our weight in there for the lighter calf, the price and weight for the heavier calf, and it'll automatically calculate the value of gain. So that 78 cents is just the example I just showed you. The other thing it does is, okay, what happens if we over or underestimate what that sell price would be? It lets us look at various sell prices and how that changed the value of gain. Now, don't get overly optimistic and think, man, that they're going to bring even more than what I think. And so that value of gains going to be really good. We got to be conservative. Remember, like I said, most of the time it's in this 75 to 85 cents range here. Then at the bottom of the spreadsheet, it just simply lets you put in feed cost. You want to have an estimate of feed conversion. For most of the feeds you're going to look at buying, you probably want to figure 8, 9, 10 pounds of feed to get a pound of gain if we're feeding higher levels of feed. And so at that price and at that conversion, you can look at what it's costing us just from a feed standpoint. And here at $250 feed, figuring an 8-to-1 conversion, it's costing us $1. So it's worth 78 cents. It cost us $1. So we're losing 22 cents a pound just from a feed standpoint in that situation. So when we think about feed options out there, here in a little bit, I'm going to talk about energy sources and protein sources of feed, or energy supplements and protein supplements. So I just wanted to kind of walk through what some examples of that would be. Energy sources, whole corn is a great energy source. And you may see a little bit of that corn passed through the animals and come out of the manure patties. Don't worry about that. We calculate that in to the energy value of the corn. That's still going to be our best buy in most cases, and going to be it's also going to be the safest when we think about different types of corn. So if we look at whole corn, typically it's going to run 88 to 89% TDN. Cracked corn is going to run about 91. Steam flake is going to run about 93. So if we just look at whole versus crack, the additional cost of purchasing that cracked corn generally does not justify the price difference. So whole corn is what I really like to use if I'm looking for energy supplements. Other examples would be 11 to 14% cubes or pellets, and realize a lot of feed companies will use the exact same formulation for a cube versus a pellet. The difference is just how big do they make that feed. So is it in a small pellet that's going to be an 1/8, 1/4, 3/8 inch in diameter, or is it a full-blown cube that's 5/8 or 3/4 inch in diameter? Soybean hulls can be another great energy source, wheat midds and rice bran. With any of these energy sources, whether we're feeding weaned calves or any other cattle, we always want to start off slow and gradually increase how much we have in the diet. If we were in a situation where we needed to have both an energy and a protein source, 20% cubes would fall in that category. Corn gluten feed, distillers grains, winter pasture. If we're in a situation where we didn't have enough winter pasture to graze them full time and we were limit grazing, that could work as well from an energy and protein source. Protein sources, and this is typically where we're going to look at more often than not when we're feeding weaned calves. Cottonseed meal, as you'll see later, is one of my top choices for weaning calves. That's typically what I personally use. One thing I really like about cottonseed meal is it's very palatable, so it gets those calves eating better, quicker. The other thing is it's very safe from a rumen standpoint. We don't have the same risk of subacute acidosis and acidosis like we do with other feeds. So cottonseed meal works really well, especially if we think about, you know, some of those calves initially are going to eat more than others. If we have one that eats too much, if we're feeding an energy supplement or even an energy and protein supplement, that's not going to work as well, and we can get into some problems. But with cottonseed meal or soybean meal, either one of them, we don't have those problems. Now, we'll tell you soybean meal is not quite as palatable as cottonseed meal, but they do eat it pretty well once they get used to it, and it can work well. If you had to feed those calves on the ground, then 38 or 40% cubes can work very well. Most of those are going to be a straight cottonseed meal cube. Some companies will tag it at 38, especially if they put a binder in there, maybe add a little calcium back to it. Other companies will tag it at 40. Those calves will eat cubes. It takes them a little longer to get to eating those cubes in cottonseed meal, but if you do need to feed on the ground, those cubes can work very well for you. So let's look at a couple scenarios here. If we were to look at grazing some high quality pasture, then we're really only looking to feed those calves to maybe improve gain. So maybe we sold those calves in a truckload lot and we sold them at a predetermined weight and we checked weighed them and they weren't weighing quite as much as what they needed to. And so we just needed to bump gains a little bit to meet our contract. Or maybe we're not worried about exactly what they're weighing because we're selling them in a commingled calf sale or something like that. We don't have a set weight we have to hit, but we do have a requirement that those calves have to be bump broke before we sell them. So we just need to teach them to eat. In either one of those situations, feeding 1 to 2 pounds of an energy supplement works well. So again, think about things like whole corn or soybean hulls, or even a 11 to 14% creep pellet. Now, if you're looking at purchasing a sacked pellet like that, how do you know what the energy is in it? Well, unfortunately, they don't tell you what the TDN is on the feed tag. So what we want to do is look at the fiber content. The higher the fiber content, the lower the energy level in that feed. So typically on those kind of feeds, what we want to look for is something that's maybe 10 or 11% crude fiber or less. If you start seeing feeds that are 16, 17, 18% crude fiber, even 15% crude fiber, that's going to be a much lower energy level and likely not going to be enough to really help you from a performance standpoint there. Well, that's going to be a little cheaper, but it's cheaper per sack. It's not cheaper per unit of nutrients. So really, if you're looking at a purchase feed, look at that crude fiber, and we want to keep it 10 or 11% or less. Okay, the other thing is if you're just needing to feed those calves to teach them to eat, maybe we only feed them for a week. And once they start eating well, then we're just going to let them have grass the rest of the time because we've met that requirement of teaching them how to eat. And then we know our grass is a much cheaper form of feed to maintain those calves on than what continuing to feed them would be. And if we're looking at medium or low quality pasture, then we're going to look at supplementing those calves with some protein supplement. Typically, we're looking at 1 to 1.5 pounds of a high protein supplement like that cottonseed meal. And by feeding that, it does a couple things. One, it supplies some nutrients that the rumen microbes need on that low quality forage diet to get them to digest that forage better, which will also result in increased intake and better performance in that situation. What you can really watch here is watch those manure patties. If they're starting to stack up, then we need to slightly increase that amount of that high protein supplement. If they're hitting the ground and splattering, we can really back off. Maybe we back down to 0.5 pound per head per day. And we can make those changes with those high protein supplements very easily. We don't have to worry about that same risk of subacute acidosis or acidosis that we would with our energy supplements. So use those manure patties to help tell you whether you want to increase or decrease the amount of that high protein supplement we're feeding. If we're dealing with high quality hay, and I would always prefer to have those calves out on pasture, they just do better on pasture than they do on a dry lot with hay. But if we do need to have them in a dry lot on hay, we want to use the best quality hay we can give them access to. So think about those species differences, think about growing differences in that hay. Hopefully we have a good forage analysis on it from some place like Dairy One, Forage Lab up in New York, or Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania, and then we can pick and choose between our cuttings of hay of which one we want to feed. But if we don't have a hay test back yet, then the rule of thumb is that first cutting in the spring and that last cutting in the fall will typically be higher quality than that hay that was cut in the summer. And then any hay that's been growing for a longer period of time and was more mature when it was baled is going to be lower quality. So pick the best quality hay we have available. In that situation, again, we're only going to supplement grain to improve weight gain on those animals or teach them how to eat. In that situation, we're typically looking at 1 to 3 pounds of an energy supplement. So notice maybe a little bit more of that energy supplement than we would use out on pasture, just because they don't perform as well on hay. Again, in this situation, start them off at a small amount and gradually increase them. And anytime we're feeding any energy supplements or combination energy and protein supplements, start off slow, feed every day, and then gradually build them up. The only time we can be more direct is if we're doing something like cottonseed meal, soybean meal, or those 38 or 40% cubes. Then we can just start them at the amount we want and don't have to gradually build them up. The other thing is a lot of people like the idea of, well, I just want to put a self-fed feeder out there for those calves. I'm going to tell you that's generally not the best option when we're talking about weaned calves, because in that situation, it's really easy to have some of those calves eat more than they need to too quick. And then what we end up doing is dropping that pH in the rumen. We get into some subacute acidosis or founder. Let me back up. We get into either subacute acidosis or acidosis, which can lead to founder, which is just those toes growing real long. It's a painful condition for those animals, so they're not going to perform as well. Or we get into some liver abscesses. So you see a healthy liver here, and you see a liver that has abscesses on it because we didn't step those cattle up slow enough. So because of that, when we're dealing with weaned calves, I really prefer to hand feed. So we go out there every day and put a certain amount of feed in the bunk based on how much they're eating rather than self-feeding them. If you are going to self-feed them, make sure you have a limiter in there and make sure it's mixed correctly and that you visited with the nutritionist from that company on that limiter to get it done right. If you do not get it done right, you can get into a real wreck in those situations. And if I was going to use a self-fed feeder on calves, I'd really want to make sure I have some some cottonseed hulls in there. That helps give me some roughage in that feed and helps provide some buffering from a rumen health standpoint. As I mentioned earlier, and I will continue to mention, I really like starting those calves on that high protein supplement, cottonseed meal, soybean meal. Those cottonseed meal cubes works real well. It's very safe compared to a textured feed or a commodity if those calves eat too much too quick. So even if you need to start them on the cottonseed meal, and once they start eating well, transition them over to some type of energy-based supplement, whether that's a mixed textured feed or whether that's a commodity like soybean hulls or corn gluten or wheat mids or something like that. Cattle just do so well when we start them off on that cottonseed meal. I mentioned early weaning, where I'm going to define early weaning as really weaning those kids at about 45 to 60 days of age. Those are going to be some very different feeding considerations. So if you do get in that situation where we need to feed those calves, make sure you contact me or contact another ruminant nutritionist, and we can work through some special feeding programs for those young calves. And we have to handle them differently because depending on whether they've just been really getting milk from that cow, you can see very little development of that rumen at that age. A little bit more development if they've been eating a little pasture or hay. And then actually on those very little calves, little grain actually helps develop that rumen and mature it. And we are actually going to feed them totally different initially. And then when they get a little bit bigger, we'll feed them just like the calves we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. So that's kind of where I wanted to stop. I wanted to make sure I left plenty of time for any questions. If something specific to your operation or question in general, please feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them. If you do have some questions later on, feel free to get a hold of Cody and he can get in hold of me, or if you want to email me, there's my email address on the screen. So any questions anybody has? We can do real quick when we wait to see if there are some questions. I'm going to switch over and actually show you that spreadsheet for those of you who may be interested in that. So you can really look at, is that feeding program going to be cost effective for my operation or not? Okay, so this is just that spreadsheet, and I'm going to blow it up so you can see it a little bit better there. There's going to be two tabs. One of them is just some directions and reminder of what's supposed to go where. And the second one's going to be the actual value of gain spreadsheet. So if we look at anything that you see in blue here is for you to go ahead and enter. All the other values, whether in black or red or green, are going to be locked and they're going to be automatically calculated. So we can just go in there and put our prices in. So let's say we wanted to look at a heavier calf, 600 pounds, or let's just say we're not going to feed them as much. So stay with their 500-pound calf, but now let's look at one that's only weighing 560 pounds. So basically he was gaining a pound a day during a 60-day weaning period. That calf's going to be bringing about $1.36. So in that situation, if we compare a 500 calf at $1.45 to a 560 calf at actually that should be $1.37, a little closer to what they're bringing this morning. We changed the value by 42.20, gained 60 pounds of weight. It was worth 70 cents. So you can go in there and play with that and really customize and look at some different options and then change your feed prices. And most of the time, if we're buying feed, we're going to be closer to maybe even $300 a ton if we're buying sack feed. So let's just say that ate even a little bit, converted a little bit better than we expected. So at 7 to 1, we're still spending $1.05 on feed, and it's only worth 70 cents. So that's there to play with. Just remember that's at the beef.tamu.edu website under spreadsheets, and you can download that if you want to look at it some more.